Welcome to Bible Shorts Q&A. Today we're going to look at, can a Christian get a biblical tattoo? So we're going to see exactly what the Bible says about that. Because some Christians who think it's okay to get a tattoo will say, well, I'm getting a verse, I'm getting a Bible verse, or I'm getting a cross, or I'm getting some symbol that represents Jesus, the Bible, or anything like that. So, does the Bible okay that? So let's see. All right, so let's go to Leviticus 19, where it talks about not to get a tattoo. It says in verse 28, you must not make any cuts in your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. All right, so it says they're very plain, but other people say, well, that's in the Old Testament. That's the Old Covenant. We are in the New Covenant, and we'll get to that. So let's see the other verses here. Leviticus chapter 18, starting in verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and tell them, I am the Lord your God. You must not follow the practices of the land of Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not follow the practices of the land of Canaan, into which I am bringing you. You must not walk in their customs. So here God clearly says, do not copy these people. And what's one of their customs? To get tattoo marks. It says, do not do that. Do not do what they do. And then we'll get a little bit much more clear why God says that. Okay. So now let's go here to Deuteronomy chapter 20, starting in 16. It says, however, in the cities of the nations that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you must not leave alive anything that breathes, for you must devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they cannot teach you to do all the detestable things they do for their gods, and so cause you to sin against the Lord your God. So basically, God detests the practices of the pagans, meaning the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. That's why God brought judgment on those people, because they were doing things that were detestable, disgusting to God. And God didn't want his people to practice that. And we're going to see exactly where their pagan practices come from. Okay, so we see here that their customs are detestable to God. And what's their custom? Tattooing. So that means that that's what? Detestable to God. Now let's go now to Deuteronomy chapter 12. Verse 31, you must not worship the Lord your God in this way, because they practice for their gods every abomination which the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. So any type of practices of the pagans, God hates. He detests that. So he says here already, you must not worship the Lord your God in this way, meaning there's Christians who believe that it's okay to get a tattoo as long as you're putting Bible verses and you're worshiping God in that way, inking your body with Bible verses or a cross. And see, and they'll say, you see, we're worshiping God because we're putting a Bible verse, like for instance, John 3:16, or a cross or some type of Christian symbol. But what does the Bible says? The Bible says you must not worship the Lord your God in this way, meaning you cannot worship God the way the pagans worship their gods. So if the pagans put tattoos, you cannot do the same thing in your body to worship God. Even if you put a verse, God says, do not worship me in that way, because their practices is actually detestable to God. God doesn't want you to ink his the body he gave you. Why? Because you were created in his image. So your body, when God created you, it didn't have tattoos, right? So then you cannot start adding things to your body that God did not intend it to have. Okay, so now we're going to go here to Deuteronomy 32. Now, mind you, it says here that they did it for their gods, the pagans. Now we're going to see here who are their gods. So in Deuteronomy 32, it says this: they provoked his jealousy with foreign gods. They enraged him with abominations. Okay, that's the customs, and that's all the things that the pagans do. They sacrificed to demons. So then when it says they did it to their gods, meaning they tattooed for their gods and things like that, practices for their gods, who were they really doing it for? Demons. So meaning tattooing was something invented by demonic spirits so that they could worship the demons in that manner. That's why God says that is detestable to him, because the way they're practicing is something that demons came up with. And God doesn't want you to use what demons came up with to worship him in that manner. So they sacrificed to demons, not to God, to gods they had not known, to newly arrived gods which your fathers did not fear. So God does not want you to worship him the way the pagans worship their demons, because if you get that practice, then you're really using demonic worship for God. That just it just doesn't even sound right coming out of my mouth. Okay, now you still say, well, that's old covenant, we're under the new covenant, so it's okay now. Now look what Paul says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I'm going to read verse 6 and 11, okay? So verse 6 says, these things took place as examples to keep us from craving evil things as they did. So Paul is looking back in the Old Testament, the Jews in the wilderness, saying, look, they did certain things and that became our examples. We got to be careful. So then you read the Old Testament to see what they did wrong so that you would not do it, and what they did right so that you could do it, and especially what God says to do and not to do, okay? Now look at verse 11. Now these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. So then the Old Testament is written down for us as warnings, not only to show that Jesus is the Messiah, to show what's going to happen in the future and things like that, but also warnings, meaning do not do the mistakes that the Israelites did. That is a warning, so do not copy them. And one of the things that the warnings that God warned us about is do not get a tattoo. So as you can see that the Old Testament is a warning for us. So if God says that tattooing is detestable to him, why would you think that all of a sudden God changed his mind and said, well, you're in a new covenant, it's okay, go get something that's detestable. I mean, I changed my mind. Now it's no longer detestable to me. Now you could get it. Apparently that's not the case. Do not do what God says not to do. So that is the warning. So can a Christian get a tattoo? Something biblical? Absolutely not. You cannot get that because that is a demonic worship. Thank you for listening.